2 years after the battle, inside a converted American military courtroom built on the grounds of the former Dachau concentration camp, a German general stood in the witness box. His name was Josef Sepp Dietrich. The Allies called him a war criminal. Hitler had once called him the most loyal soldier in the Reich. He had commanded the 6th SS Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, and the American prosecutor asked him a question no German general had yet answered honestly in open court. General Dietrich, why did Operation Wacht am Rhein fail? Dietrich looked down at his hands before he answered. He was 53 years old, a former butcher's apprentice who had commanded Hitler's personal bodyguard, fought in Poland, France, Russia, and Belgium, and worn the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, and his answer ran to exactly 6 words. We did not take Bastogne. No elaboration, no apology, just that. This is the story of why. In December 1944, the war in Europe was supposed to be ending. The Allies had liberated Paris, pushed across the Rhineland, broken into Belgium, and most American commanders believed the Wehrmacht no longer had the strength for a major offensive. They were wrong. In the bunkers of central Germany, Hitler had drawn out a plan extraordinary in its ambition, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes, the same forest Germany had used to outflank France in 1940, driving northwest to the port of Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies in two. If it worked, he believed, the Western Allies might be forced to negotiate. The plan was named Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, and 3 armies assembled in absolute secrecy. Radio silence enforced, troops moved only at night, aircraft engines used to mask the sound of tanks, until, by the morning of December 16th, more than 200,000 German soldiers sat undetected in the snow-covered forest. The northern arm belonged to Dietrich. The southern arm, under General Erich Brandenberger, was tasked with protecting the flank. The center, the crucial middle, belonged to a different kind of soldier entirely. His name was Hasso von Manteuffel, 47 years old, barely 5.5 feet tall, a slight, wiry man from old Prussian military aristocracy, who had been a cavalryman before there were tanks, who spoke French and English and read philosophy in his spare time, and who was, by the assessment of nearly every officer who served under him, one of the most genuinely intelligent armored commanders Germany produced in the entire war. Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army, and his mission was simple to state and brutally hard to execute. Break the American line, race across Belgium, and seize a modest market town of perhaps 4,000 pre-war inhabitants, sitting in a shallow valley, a town called Bastogne. Bastogne itself had no strategic weight of its own. What it had was 7 roads meeting at its center, and in terrain this steep, this densely forested, this buried under snow, those 7 roads were the only practical way to move armor west at speed. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network. Whoever controlled the roads controlled the entire offensive. Manteuffel's plan was simple. Hit fast, take the town, keep moving, and he had perhaps 4 or 5 days before the Americans could reinforce. He believed, as did Dietrich, as did Hitler, that the American units holding this stretch of line would not hold. The 28th Infantry Division had been mauled in the Hürtgen Forest. The 99th and the 106th were green. In that specific assessment, the Germans were entirely correct. On the first morning of the offensive, German artillery opened with a barrage so intense that American soldiers in forward positions genuinely believed the world was ending. Communications collapsed within minutes. By midday, entire battalions of the 106th Division were surrounded or routed. The 28th was breaking apart, and Manteuffel's panzers began rolling west with the road to Bastogne opening in front of them. 120 miles to the southwest, in a French town called Mourmelon-le-Grand, 15,000 American soldiers were trying to sleep. They belonged to the 101st Airborne Division, back from Holland barely 2 weeks earlier after 72 consecutive days of fighting in Operation Market Garden, an airborne operation that had failed, left them holding ground meant for regular infantry, and bled them badly at Eindhoven, Wegel, and along what soldiers had started calling Hell's Highway. They'd returned to France understrength, undersupplied, and simply exhausted, needing replacement uniforms, winter boots, ammunition, and above all, rest. The division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, wasn't with them. He was in Washington attending a conference on airborne doctrine, having left his division in safe rear billets with no expectation they'd be needed before the new year. When the German offensive began, Taylor couldn't get back in time and command fell to his deputy, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, 46, an artillery officer by training who had helped develop American airborne doctrine, but had never commanded an infantry division in sustained combat. His specialty was guns, not foxholes. On the afternoon of December 17th, McAuliffe received the order that would define the rest of his life: deploy immediately to a Belgian town called Bastogne to help halt a German offensive whose scale was still unclear. They would move by truck, leaving that night. McAuliffe asked how long they had to prepare. 18 hours. What followed was one of the strangest deployments of the entire war. The division had no winter clothing. Most men were still in Summerfield uniforms, some without helmets, some without rifles, since the supply situation at Mourmelon had never fully recovered from the losses in Holland. The trucks meant to carry them were standard open cargo trucks with no canvas covers, in weather already below freezing. The paratroopers climbed in anyway, drove through the night on icy roads with taped-down blackout headlights, sat shoulder to shoulder with knees drawn up, breathing into their hands. As they drove east, they began passing other American vehicles going the opposite way, soldiers from the 28th and 106th, from scattered combat engineer and artillery units overrun in the offensive's first 2 days, retreating with hollow faces and frost-bitten fingers, some walking beside their own vehicles because the vehicles were too full of wounded. They shouted warnings at the paratroopers heading the other direction. Turn around, the Germans have tanks, the SS is coming, there are tigers in the woods. What mattered was what the paratroopers actually did with that warning. At fuel stops, they climbed out of their trucks, walked over to the retreating men, and asked quietly if they could borrow rifles. The men of the 28th and 106th handed them over. Garands, bandoliers of ammunition, light machine guns, grenades, bazookas, field dressings, whatever they had, some apologizing, some saying nothing at all. Entire companies of the 100 first arrived at Bastogne carrying weapons that, 12 hours earlier, had belonged to other men entirely. It's not in most of the popular histories. It's in the unit diaries and after-action reports, and I think it's one of the small details that tells you most honestly what was actually happening on those roads. Not a uniform machine moving with purpose, but something closer to an army being torn apart and stitched back together in real time, in the dark, by men who had simply decided they weren't arriving empty-handed. They reached Bastogne on the morning of December 19th. Here's the second thing worth understanding clearly, since it rarely survives into the popular version of this story. The 101st Airborne was not the first American unit to reach the town. The previous evening, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, under Colonel William Roberts, had already arrived, pulled out of reserve and sent north to plug whatever gap it could find. Roberts split his force into 3 teams and pushed them out along the approaches. Major William de Sobry's team north toward Neuville, directly into the path of the 2nd Panzer Division. Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara's team southeast toward Warden, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Cherry's team east toward Longueville, into the path of Panzer Lehr under General Fritz Bayerlein himself. By the time the 100 first arrived, Roberts was already fighting, his tanks already engaged, his command post already running on half a day of continuous combat. The defense of Bastogne began as an armored operation. The paratroopers reinforced it. They didn't start it. What the 100 first brought that Roberts's tankers didn't already have wasn't rifles or numbers, it was a specific psychology. Roberts himself, in those first chaotic hours, had also done something almost nobody remembers today. He gathered every stray soldier drifting through Bastogne without a unit. Cooks, clerks, drivers, separated from their own outfits in the retreat. into a single scratch formation his own men nicknamed Team Snafu, after the well-worn Army acronym for a situation gone thoroughly wrong, and put them on the perimeter with whatever weapons could be found. It is a small, almost comic detail sitting inside a genuinely desperate situation, and I think it says something true about how this defense actually held together in its first hours, not through some tidy chain of command functioning exactly as designed, but through officers on the ground, simply refusing to let any man with a pulse and 2 working hands stand around doing nothing useful. Airborne doctrine assumed, as a matter of course, that a unit would land behind enemy lines, cut off from supply, holding ground with no flanks and no line of retreat. The founder of American Airborne Forces, Major General William Lee, had given his men a single defining principle. The word surrounded simply meant the enemy was now in range in every direction. It sounded, the first time you heard it, almost like a joke. It wasn't. It was an operational philosophy the men of the 101st had internalized the way other soldiers internalized the manual of arms. And when they looked at a map showing German forces converging on Bastogne from 3 sides, they didn't see a crisis. They saw an ordinary Tuesday. By the morning of the 19th, the perimeter was forming. It would eventually run 16 miles in circumference, holding roughly 18,000 American soldiers inside it. The 101st, CCB of the 10th Armored, CCR of the 9th Armored, stragglers from the 28th, engineers, medics, cooks who'd been handed rifles, truck drivers turned infantry. Outside it, closing by the hour, sat 5 German divisions: Panzer Lehr, the 26th Volksgrenadier, elements of the 2nd Panzer, with more moving up from the rear. Fog rolled in that night and didn't lift for days. Air support was impossible. Resupply was impossible. Evacuation of the wounded was impossible. The men in the perimeter didn't know it yet, but the only general who could break through to relieve them, George S. Patton, was still hundreds of miles away in Luxembourg, about to be asked by Eisenhower to do something no general in the modern era had ever managed: turn an entire army 90 degrees in midwinter and attack north. At a command conference on December 19th, with the ink barely dry on the reports of the German breakthrough, Patton reportedly told Eisenhower he could have 3 divisions on the road within 48 hours. A claim most of the other officers in the room privately assumed was bravado, since redirecting an army already committed to an offensive of its own on icy roads in a Belgian winter was not something any staff college taught as achievable on that timeline. Patton's own staff had, in fact, already quietly begun sketching contingency plans for exactly this pivot days earlier, on nothing more than his own hunch that the German buildup opposite the Ardennes looked wrong. Third Army did move within the promised window, more than 100,000 vehicles reorienting north over roads coated in ice, and the maneuver has been cited by military historians ever since as one of the more genuinely remarkable logistical feats of the entire war, though it would still take Patton's spearhead until the day after Christmas to physically reach the perimeter, which meant every day before that arrival belonged entirely to the men already inside it. For now, on the morning of the 19th, the men at Bastogne began to dig. 100 meters to the east, in a command bunker overlooking his own attack, Hasso von Manteuffel watched the incoming reports and began, for the first time in the entire operation, to feel something he hadn't felt since June of 1940. The sense that his timetable had slipped. He didn't yet know what that would cost him. He would learn. They dug through the night of the 19th and into the 20th, first with entrenching tools, then, when the tools bounced uselessly off the iron-hard earth, with bayonets, and when the bayonets bent with their bare hands, scraping until their fingers bled and the blood froze in the cuts. One man dug, while another stood watch, and a third tried to sleep curled in the bottom of the hole with his helmet over his face. The temperature that morning had dropped to 22 below freezing. This was the United States Army in the Ardennes. This was what was about to meet the German war machine head-on. That same morning, the village of Noville fell. It had been held by Désibry's team, reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry, for 36 hours against the entire weight of the 2nd Panzer Division. De Saubry himself was gravely wounded during the fighting, struck in the head by shell fragments and evacuated by ambulance toward the rear, an ambulance that never reached Bastogne, intercepted on the road by a German patrol and captured whole. De Saubry, unconscious and bleeding, spent the rest of the war a prisoner in a German hospital in a chain of prison camps, and wouldn't learn until April 1945 what had actually happened to the men he'd left behind at Nouville. The survivors fell back into the main perimeter, bringing their wounded, whatever equipment they could still carry, and, for the ones who could still speak clearly, a first-hand understanding of exactly what was coming. Panthers with sloped frontal armor American bazookas couldn't reliably beat. Trained, well-equipped Wehrmacht infantry, not exhausted conscripts being pushed forward at gunpoint. On December 21st, the encirclement closed completely. The last open road south toward Neufchâteau, cut by the lead elements of the German 5th Parachute Division. The 101st, and everyone trapped alongside them, were now entirely alone. No ground link, no air resupply, since the fog still hadn't lifted and the C-47s of 9th Troop Carrier Command couldn't navigate to drop zones they couldn't see. Inside the perimeter, the wounded had already begun dying in real numbers. The 326th Airborne Medical Company had been overrun on the night of the 19th, the Germans capturing 11 physicians, including the division surgeon, along with most of the division's surgical supplies and roughly 100 wounded men too badly hurt to be moved. The senior medical officer left inside the perimeter was Major Jack Pryor, 33, a country doctor from Vermont before the war, who set up a new aid station in a warehouse in the center of town with almost no morphine, almost no plasma, and no surgical instruments beyond what fit in his personal kit. Operating by candlelight on a table built from stacked crates, assisted by a Belgian civilian nurse, 29-year-old Renée Lemaire, who had simply volunteered when she saw the wounded being carried in. She would be killed 3 days later when a German bomb hit the aid station directly on Christmas Eve. There is a part of this siege that gets almost no attention in any English-language telling of it, and I think it deserves at least a paragraph here rather than none at all. Roughly 3,000 Belgian civilians were still inside Bastogne when the encirclement closed, unable to evacuate and living through the same artillery barrages, the same cold, and much of the same hunger as the soldiers defending them. Many sheltered in the town's Récollets convent and in cellars beneath the main square, sharing what little food remained with American troops who had none of their own. Local bakers reportedly kept ovens running through the siege to feed both civilians and soldiers with whatever flour could still be found. When the Luftwaffe bombed the town on Christmas Eve, the same raid that destroyed Jack Pryor's aid station and killed Renée Lemaire, the civilian toll ran into the dozens in a town that had no military reason of its own to exist beyond the roads running through it. Bastogne's own people were never given a vote on whether their crossroads mattered enough to die for. It mattered anyway, and they paid a share of that price nobody asked them to pay. On the afternoon of December 22nd, 2 German officers walked toward the American lines under a white flag. Major Alvin Wagner, a senior staff officer, and a younger lieutenant, Helmuth Henke, fluent in English, carrying a leather case along a road that had been mined, cleared, and remined more than once. An American sergeant at the forward outpost of 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry, pointed his carbine at them and asked what they wanted. Henke answered that they were parlementaires, carrying a message for the American commander. Blindfolded, they were led back through the lines, and the leather case was opened in front of McAuliffe. A typed document, 2 pages, part formal German and part broken English, demanding the honorable surrender of the encircled town within 2 hours. Or else artillery and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions would annihilate the American forces in and around Bastogne, closing with a strange note of civility that heavy civilian casualties from such a bombardment would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. McAuliffe read it in a small basement room in the Heinz barracks that the 101st had requisitioned as its command post, lit by a single bulb off a portable generator, a small wood stove burning against roughly 40 degrees of indoor cold. He let the paper drop to the desk and said one word: nuts. His staff, for a moment, genuinely thought he hadn't understood the question. His operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, 29, broke the silence and asked what he wanted, put in the written reply. McAuliffe said he didn't know. Kinnard suggested that his first remark would be hard to bait. McAuliffe looked at him, looked around the room, looked back down at the German ultimatum, and nodded. The formal reply went out on a single typed sheet, carried back to the waiting German officers by Colonel Joseph Harper, 43, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, to the German commander, Nuts, the American commander. Henke read it twice and asked, with something close to genuine confusion, what the word actually meant. Harper considered his answer and told him it meant roughly the same thing as "go to hell," then removed their blindfolds and walked them back to the edge of the perimeter, where he turned and told them, "On your way, and good luck to you," probably the strangest courtesy paid by any American officer to an enemy all war, wishing two emissaries good fortune on their way back to the army about to attack him. The reply eventually reached General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the German 47th Panzer Corps and the officer who drafted the ultimatum in the first place. He didn't understand the word either and had to have it explained to him by Henke. His private reaction wasn't recorded for history, though the promised artillery bombardment never actually opened exactly at the 2-hour deadline. The ultimatum, at least in part, had been a bluff. The men inside Bastogne had no way of knowing that. What they knew was that their commander had told the German army to go to hell in writing, with witnesses, while the perimeter shrank and the wounded died and the temperature kept falling. And the word spread through the division within hours, runner to sergeant to squad to the next squad over, until by nightfall every man in the 101st Airborne knew exactly what General McAuliffe had said. What it did to the men inside the perimeter is hard to translate into plain language now. It wasn't bravado, and it wasn't propaganda. It was simply the moment they understood, with total clarity, that they weren't going to be surrendered. Their commander had already made that decision for them. Here is something worth stating plainly, because it runs directly against the popular memory of this battle, and most film treatments have quietly left it out. The force surrounding Bastogne in those first critical days was not the SS. There were no Waffen-SS divisions in the encirclement on December 22nd when that ultimatum arrived. The units investing the town were Panzer Lehr under Bayerlein, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under Heinz Kokott, and elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, regular Wehrmacht formations. The SS was 60 miles north, fighting an entirely separate battle on the offensive's northern shoulder, grinding itself apart against the American 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions at Elsenborn Ridge. I think that distinction matters more than a footnote, because popular memory has compressed two separate stories into one clean, simpler narrative, and the actual truth is more uncomfortable for the German side specifically. It was the regular army, 5 years convinced of its own tactical superiority over any other force in Europe, that hit this particular wall and broke against it. On the night of December 22nd, Kokott wrote in his own command log that the Americans inside the perimeter were fighting with a level of determination he hadn't expected. He was 44, had commanded troops in Russia, had seen what desperate men were capable of, and wasn't given to romanticizing his enemies. But what he watched unfold in front of his division was, by his own post-war admission, something his training simply hadn't prepared him to defeat. He had assumed, like Luttwitz, like Manteuffel, like Hitler himself, that American troops sealed inside a closed pocket would degrade quickly. The cold weakening them, the hunger weakening them, the isolation weakening them, until they surrendered within a week. By the morning of December 23rd, 6 days into the fighting, none of that had happened. The perimeter hadn't shrunk. If anything, American positions had become more organized and more interlocking, the men quietly repositioning overnight while German staff officers slept, until German artillery was firing on grid coordinates that had already gone stale. That same morning the fog finally lifted, the sky cleared, and the U.S. Army Air Forces arrived overhead. C-47s of 9th Troop Carrier Command, having taken off from English airfields before dawn and crossed Belgium at low altitude in clear winter light, dropped 144 tons of supplies through Pathfinder-marked drop zones. Ammunition, medical supplies, rations, radio batteries, fuel, the parachutes, color-coded by cargo type, white for medical, red for ammunition, blue for food, orange for radio gear, and men who had been dug into frozen holes for days ran out to gather the canopies in with what some later described as something close to a religious feeling. That afternoon, P-47 Thunderbolts came in low enough that men in the foxholes could see the pilots' faces through the canopy glass, strafing German artillery and armor sortie after sortie for the rest of the day. German attacks slowed, they didn't stop, and German command understood exactly what the clear weather meant. The window for taking Bastogne by direct assault was closing fast, with Patton's spearhead already cutting through the snow toward the southern edge of the pocket. The German command committed to one final all-out assault, timed for Christmas Day, led by the 26th Volksgrenadier, reinforced with elements of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, pulled up specifically for the attack, aimed at cracking the perimeter's western face at a village called Champs, defended by the 502nd Parachute Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis. German infantry came across open snow in white assault suits with 18 Mark IVs and assault guns behind them, the last armor the Germans could spare for that face of the perimeter, and the fighting inside Champs itself went hand to hand within the first hour, rifles and grenades and bayonets in the dark, too close for any artillery support on either side. And then something happened that the German had never planned for at all. A column of roughly 18 of those tanks broke through the American line west of Champs and kept moving east in the dark, disoriented by fighting across snow-covered ground that didn't match their own maps, veering south of its intended axis until it emerged, entirely by accident, not behind the American infantry line, but directly into the divisional artillery park of the 101st Airborne, straight into the gun line of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. The men of the 463rd were artillerymen, trained to fire indirect missions off coordinates called in by forward observers, not infantry trained to fight tanks at close range. But they were paratroopers who had spent 5 straight days being told there was nowhere left to retreat to, and when German tanks came rolling out of the tree line in the gray light of Christmas morning, the gun crews did the only thing left available to them. They dropped the muzzles of their 75mm pack howitzers to point flat and level, loaded high explosive, and fired directly into the German armor at point-blank range. The first volley killed 3 Mark IVs outright. The second killed 2 more. Within 20 minutes, 7 German tanks were burning in the field east of Champs. The survivors, unable to maneuver in the soft ground, were picked off where they sat, and the infantry that had been following them into the gap was cut down by a hastily assembled line of cooks, drivers, and signalmen pulled from the rear and handed rifles for the occasion. The Christmas Day assault on Bastogne collapsed before noon. In a farmhouse a few miles east, Kokot sat at a kitchen table the evening and wrote a report to von Lüttwitz, acknowledging that the attack had failed, that his division had taken catastrophic losses, and that further operations against the western perimeter were no longer realistic. What he actually thought while writing it, he wouldn't put on paper until years later in a very different room, once the empire that had sent him there no longer existed, and there was nothing left to protect by staying quiet. On the afternoon of December 26th, a column of Shermans from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, 3rd Army, crossed a small rise outside the village of Assenoise, the same battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams that had already broken through to the perimeter and shaken hands with the first defenders it found there. A moment this channel has already told the fuller version of elsewhere. What matters here is simpler. The siege was over. 8 days of combat, 6 of them fully encircled, ended with tired men on both sides, too cold and too worn down for much more than a nod, a handshake, a shared cigarette lit with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Maxwell Taylor flew back from Washington that evening and formally resumed command. McAuliffe, who had spent 8 days as acting commander of a surrounded division under attack from 5 German divisions in the worst winter anyone could remember, didn't complain about being replaced. He went back to his howitzers. McAuliffe stayed in uniform for another decade and a half, eventually commanding U.S. Army forces in Europe before retiring in 1956. Asked for the rest of his life about the word that had made him briefly famous, he tended to downplay it, insisting in interviews that it had been an unremarkable piece of soldiers' slang and not the calculated act of defiance later retellings made it out to be. He died in 1975 and is buried at Arlington. Most tellings of this story end there. Siege broken, division relieved, Patton arrived, battle won. But the 101st didn't go home, and the worst of it, for a specific and less remembered reason, was still ahead of them. In a bunker hundreds of miles east, Hitler received news of the breakthrough and refused to accept that the offensive was finished. He ordered the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, his own original bodyguard formation, already ground down fighting at Stoumont and Cheneux on the offensive's northern shoulder, pulled out and sent south under Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke, 33, a hard, dark-faced officer who had climbed through the SS from its earliest days and had been investigated, though never prosecuted, for the killing of British prisoners at Wormhout in 1940. Mohnke's orders were to link up with the 167th Volksgrenadier Division and attack the eastern flank of the corridor Patton had just opened, aiming to cut the road again. The attack struck on New Year's Day, 1945, at a village called L'Outrebois, southeast of Bastogne, falling primarily on the 35th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored, but the eastern face of the 101st's own perimeter, held by elements of the 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry, came under heavy pressure from the same push, and for the first time in the entire battle, men of the 101st were fighting directly against soldiers of the Waffen-SS, rather than the regular army. The fighting at L'Outrebois ran 4 days. The 1st SS Panzer Division lost more than 30 tanks and assault guns in that stretch, along with officers it had no way to replace and, in a real sense, the institutional cohesion it had carried through 5 years of war. The Leibstandarte, the formation Hitler had personally built from nothing, fought its last serious offensive action of the entire war in the snow outside a Belgian village most Americans still can't pronounce correctly, and then simply stopped. Around the same time, in his own command bunker further east, Manteuffel wrote a report recommending the immediate withdrawal of every armored formation still in the Ardennes salient, arguing plainly that the offensive had failed and that continued attacks would only feed more men and machines into a fight that could no longer produce a strategic result. Hitler read it and rejected it outright. The attacks continued anyway, smaller now and more desperate, spending resources Germany genuinely no longer had. Manteuffel, in his memoirs years later, described that specific stretch of the campaign as the moment he understood with total clarity that the war wasn't merely going badly, it was already decided. He kept issuing orders anyway because he was a soldier and soldiers issue orders, and the men in the foxholes deserved leadership even from a commander who had privately stopped believing in the cause he was still directing them to die for. It's a particular kind of grief no military manual prepares an officer to carry, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it, because it complicates the easy version of the story where the villains simply lose and walk away. Some of them kept doing their jobs perfectly well after they'd already concluded the job was pointless. The 101st stayed at Bastogne through the rest of December and into the middle of January, still taking casualties, still losing men to frostbite and trench foot, and the smaller, unglamorous violence of a battle nobody outside the perimeter was watching closely anymore. They were withdrawn from the line on January 17th, having suffered roughly 1,641 casualties across the whole operation, a smaller number than the legend that grew around it, and still large enough. The men who walked out of Bastogne walked out as a genuinely different division than the one that had arrived. Not because they'd somehow become better soldiers in 3 weeks. They had already been excellent soldiers on the night they climbed into those open cargo trucks, But because they had been tested at the absolute outer limit of what their training had prepared them for, and hadn't failed it, the German officers who faced them wrote about it themselves in the years that followed, once there was nothing left to protect by lying. Dietrich, standing in that courtroom at Dachau, needed only those same 6 words from the beginning of this story. Manteuffel, interviewed after the war by the British historian Basil Liddell Hart, gave a longer answer, comparing Bastogne to a fishbone lodged in the throat of the entire German advance. His army, he said, could neither swallow it nor cough it back out, and the bone was still sitting there when he was finally ordered to withdraw. Kokot, writing a post-war manuscript for the U.S. Army's Historical Division, put down on paper what he hadn't been able to write at the kitchen table in Belgium on Christmas night, that he had genuinely assumed American soldiers sealed inside a closed pocket would degrade quickly, that the assumption had been simply wrong, and that the 101st Airborne had fought with a cohesion and discipline his own training had never prepared him to defeat. He didn't call them heroes or supermen in that manuscript. He called them what they were. He called them paratroopers. 80 years have passed since the siege. The men who held that perimeter are almost all gone now. The last surviving veterans of the 101st, well into their late 90s, most of them already laid to rest beside the men who never came home from Belgium at all. In the American cemetery at Luxembourg City, beneath rows of white marble crosses, more than 5,000 Americans are buried, George S., Patton among them, who asked before he died to be interred with his own men rather than separately. The grass over those graves has stayed green for 80 winters through the work of a small staff of Belgian and Luxembourgish caretakers, the children and grandchildren of the people those particular Americans came to free, who tend the stones in every kind of weather and, by every account, have never needed anyone to explain to them why. What happened at Bastogne wasn't a miracle, and I don't think the word does it any favors. It was the accumulated result of one decision made independently by roughly 15,000 individual men alone in their own foxholes, in the cold, with the wounded dying around them and the perimeter shrinking by the day. The decision that they were not leaving, not surrendering, not stepping back. The German army, for all its genuine tactical skill, had a doctrine for soldiers who eventually broke under that kind of pressure. It never developed one for soldiers who simply wouldn't. By the time German commanders understood the difference between the two, sitting in courtrooms and writing memoirs years after the fact, they had already lost the argument in the only place it actually mattered, in the frozen ground outside a small Belgian crossroads town most of their own maps had never marked as important. If a relative of yours served with the 101st Airborne, the 10th Armored, or any of the scattered units that ended up inside that perimeter, cooks, drivers, engineers, anyone handed a rifle who hadn't expected to need one, I'd genuinely like to hear whatever they told you about those 8 days in the comments, because so much of what actually happened inside that ring of snow and frozen ground never made it into any official history at all.